This land is not truly called Africa. You'll feel it by the time you're done. Feel it in your chest. Not just know it, since this isn't a lesson in history, it's a reckoning before Rome existed. This land, the oldest land on earth, had a name prior to Greece becoming a civilization, had a name while everyone else was still struggling to survive, and that name was taken discreetly, methodically, and with complete purpose. However, before we reach that name, which you will see why it is so important, the name is only the surface. So you must first explore what was here. There is a whole world beneath it that most people have never seen. Let's go all the way back to the time when this land was able to speak for itself. There was never just one thing about this land. The first thing that most people overlook is that Africa conjures up images of a single location, culture, and narrative. However, this land was a universe, a collection of civilizations so deep, intricate, and multi-layered that, even with all of our contemporary tools and technology, historians are still discovering things that completely alter our preconceived notions on this land. Some people built with stone, while others used mud. There were individuals here who accurately charted the motions of stars, a fact that contemporary scientists have verified. The interior of this continent was connected to the coasts of China, India, and Arabia through trade networks thousands of years ago, not hundreds. These advanced legal systems, spiritual philosophies, medical practices, architectural designs, and agricultural techniques served as the basis for the greatness of other civilizations, and long before the word Africa was ever used. All of this was taking place here on this land. The Numidians were a people who lived in the ancient north along the borders where this land meets the Mediterranean Sea. Additionally, if you are unfamiliar with the Numidians, you should take the time to learn about them, because history has purposefully understated their extraordinary qualities. The ancient world had never seen horsemen like the Numidians. They used only their knees and their will to guide their horses while riding, without saddles or bridles in combat. They were swift, erratic, and devastating. Numidian cavalry accompanied the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal as he crossed the Alps and brought Rome to its knees, inflicting some of the most devastating damage. Rome had to put up a fierce fight against the Numidians. Despite having conquered most of the known world, Roman generals were humiliated during the years-long guerrilla campaign, led by their king, Jugurtha, against Rome one after the other. The Roman Senate reportedly claimed that this war was exhausting them more than any other adversary, because they were so irritated and ashamed the world's most powerful empire was rendered ridiculous by a man from this land. The Numidians did not identify as Africans. They had their own name, identity, and pride because they belonged to this land. Carthage came next. Carthage made Rome existential, while the Numidians made it uneasy. Carthage was more than a city. It was a maritime empire created by individuals who were adept at navigating the sea, giving them command over trade routes throughout the western Mediterranean. Carthage was wealthy, powerful militarily, had a highly developed government, and its influence reached far into this continent, as well as into Sardinia and Spain. Rome engaged in 3 bloody, protracted battles with Carthage. Furthermore, Rome was not content to just defeat Carthage. After winning, they set it on fire. Every building, every wall, every structure was destroyed. The intention was obvious, though there is historical disagreement over whether they actually salted the earth afterwards. Rome's goals went beyond simply vanquishing Carthage. Rome desired its erasure, wanted to ensure that nothing would ever emerge from that ground again, not a stone, not a memory, not an idea. Carthage threatened them to that extent. It is not a sign of weakness when your adversary must eliminate every trace of you in order to feel secure. That is evidence of your strength. Nubia, also called Kush, was a civilization further south that was deeper and older than Egypt in many respects. There were more pyramids in Nubia than in Egypt, and they were sharper and more precisely constructed, a feat that still baffles engineers. Gold was produced in Nubia. Massive amounts of gold flowed northward into Egypt and beyond. However, Nubia did not serve Egypt. Egypt's equal was Nubia. Additionally, Nubia ruled Egypt at some points in the past. The pharaohs of Egypt's 25th dynasty, who ruled over one of the greatest civilizations in human history, were Nubian. Dark-skinned southerners who came north. The backbone that kept everything upright in the ancient world was Nubia. However, Nubia only receives 1 or 2 paragraphs in the majority of history textbooks distributed to students worldwide. The Greeks used the term Ethiopians to refer to the people of this continent, rather than a single contemporary nation. It was not an insult. The Greek word meant burnt-faced people. It was applied reverently. The greatest Greek poet of antiquity, Homer, wrote about Ethiopians. He said that the gods of Olympus themselves would descend to feast among them because they were such a noble, virtuous, and adored people. To eat with the people of this land. The gods departed from heaven. Homer wrote that the Greeks of antiquity held this belief about the inhabitants of this continent. The outside world could see what resided here, even in their admiration in the 700s. The Moors, who arrived later in history, but carried on the ancient flame, entered Europe and established a civilization in Spain that made everything around them appear archaic. Moorish cities had lit streets, hospitals, paved roads, libraries with hundreds of thousands of books, and street lighting, while the rest of Europe was in complete darkness with torches burning at night. In addition to advanced medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, the Moors introduced algebra to Europe. Europe's Renaissance did not happen by coincidence. After centuries of contact with the Moors, it began its renaissance. After taking in, imitating, and learning from this land's inhabitants, what was present was this person was present. Let's now discuss the name. The word Africa, from where did it originate? It was given by whom? Furthermore, what does it really mean? Because at this point, the narrative becomes more than just history. It becomes a personal story that ought to infuriate you, anger that awakens you, not the kind that destroys. Originally, the term Africa was used by the Romans to refer to a single province in what is now northern Tunisia. Only a province, a portion of conquered territory that Rome named for administrative convenience. Not the entire continent, not the vast ancient enormous landmass extending from the Mediterranean down to the Cape. However, as European powers spread their maps and influence over an increasing amount of this territory, they eventually extended that provincial designation throughout the entire continent. Millions of miles of ancient civilization were covered by a single colonial label, and the locals were taught to use that name generation after generation. As a result of slavery, colonization, forced education, and cultural destruction, were instructed to refer to their home by the name that their conquerors had given it. However, from what source did the Romans obtain the word? We slow down at this point because it's important. One of the most frequently mentioned etymological roots of the name Africa is the ancient Greek word Ava, and something uncomfortable comes to light when you examine its true meaning rather than just its surface interpretation. This is how a freak breaks down in ancient Greek. The prefix a means without, absence, negation, or removal, the word's root, freak. The majority of people have never been informed that this part is cold. However, it also connotes terror, horror, and coldness. Ancient Greek for the same word. These two elements coexisted within a single concept. Thus, the word that may have originated in Africa is translated as without cold, but it also means without horror, a place without cold, a horror-free land, a location that was immune to Europe's terrible, freezing winters, a place where the harsh cold, the terror of winter, and the frost-induced death that characterized European life were non-existent. Now stop there. Consider what it reveals. The people who gave this land its names did so based on their personal experiences and fears. From their point of view, the cold they feared and the terror of their own winters were what this continent lacked. This land was named for their absence rather than its presence, for what this land was. They did not give it a name. They gave it that name because it was different from them. Before colonization even developed into a formal system, this is one of the oldest colonial ploys, and it was ingrained in the name itself. When you describe a place solely in terms of yourself, you erase its identity. Everything else becomes a variation of you or an absence of you, without horror or coldness once you establish your experience as the norm. As if the lack of a European issue was necessary to characterize the greatest land on earth, as if the mother of humanity could be reduced to a place devoid of winter. Nevertheless, even in that diminished outsider description, the truth leaked through without horror. And this is what breaks you open if you sit with it long enough without the terror, since there was no terror in this land. There was life in this land. Life began on this land. This land was warm, while Europe shivered through its dark ages, with people dying from famines and plagues and living in fear of their own winters. This land was expanding. This land was under construction. Even the Greeks and Romans, who eventually came to exploit this continent, acknowledged that there was no horror here when they named it. That the darkness that characterized their own world did not exist here. They simply couldn't bring themselves to admit what it was. They then stated what it wasn't, and the entire world now uses that somewhat inaccurate name. However, the Greeks did not have to tell the inhabitants of this land that they were not afraid. They were already aware of their possessions. They had given it a name already. A name that didn't reflect who they were in comparison to others. A name that in their own words and in their own language. Perfectly captured who they were and what this land meant to them. Albion is that name. Ayakolan put it out there, allow it to land. Albion scholars from antiquity have documented this name according to historical accounts. The Moors went by this name long before Rome constructed its first road. This name was alive and well long before Greece hosted its first Olympic Games, long before any foreign nation dared to fly a flag on territory that was never theirs. Albion, furthermore, it does not describe the weather. It has nothing to do with temperature. It is not an outsider observing what is missing. It means mother of mankind. Some translations refer to it as the Garden of Eden. They both indicate the same reality. This land was aware that it was the source, it was aware that it was the origin. This is where the earliest humans walked here. The first families were raised. This is where the first societies, the first spiritual comprehension of the world, and the first attempt to give life purpose all started thus. The inhabitants of this land refer to it as the mother of mankind, not without horror, not sunny, not a province on a Roman map. You should feel the weight of that. Africa is an external name derived from a Greek word that characterizes this land as being free of horror and cold, an account that focuses on the experiences of outsiders and names this place based on the suffering that Europeans did not have to endure. The original name Erkabulan, on the other hand, refers to this land as the mother of all humanity, the garden, the beginning, and the source of everything that came after. Absence is the subject of one name. The other is about everything. One name describes what is absent from the European experience by looking at this land from the outside. The other name describes what this land gave to the world by looking at it from the inside out. This is a significant distinction. This is not a linguistics debate. This distinguishes a genuine identity from one that has been stolen between a name given to you by your ancestors who created you and a label imposed on you by someone who defeated you, and this is what was buried on purpose. Because Albion's disappearance from the public consciousness was not an accident, the fact that the children of this land only learned the name their colonizers gave them as children was not a coincidence. It was a brutal system that had been in place for a long time and was intended to cut off the people of this land from their own history. Here, schools were constructed that penalized kids for using their native tongues. Missionaries arrived and declared that the people's spiritual practices that predate Christianity, Islam, and all organized religions in the West were wicked. Libraries caught fire. Oral traditions were ridiculed. Elders who carried the memory were ignored and treated with contempt. And the gap between the people of this land and the name Albion widened with each generation. Every generation saw the birth of children who had never heard the word, who had never been informed that their homeland had a name prior to the arrival of the colonists, and who were raised to believe that the story began with the arrival of outsiders, as if everything had been in the dark and waiting. The true horror is that not the cold weather, not the Greek freak, what was done to a people's memory is the true horror. However, the name endured. Truth is tenacious, which is why it survived, because there are individuals who are unwilling to let go in every generation. Elders, academics, historians, and regular people who sensed a discrepancy in the version of history they were given persisted in their search for the truth. The name Albion endured in manuscripts, in the works of Muslim scholars who chronicled the ancient customs of this continent, and in the writings of historians such as Yusuf ben Yohannan, who devoted his life to reclaiming what had been taken, sitting in archives and libraries and unearthing centuries worth of hidden truth to return it to its rightful owners. Because the people of this land survived, so did the names. The truth is present as long as they are. You are watching this right now. You also know something that the majority of people who use the word Africa on a daily basis are unaware of. You are aware that the Greeks described this land as being free of horror and cold, that they were unable to conceal the reality that it was a place of life rather than death, warmth rather than suffering, greatness rather than absence. You are aware that the Latin roots denoted warmth and the sun, that even Rome, which enslaved the people of this land and burned Carthage, was unable to name it without acknowledging its light. Rome was made to bleed by the Numidians that before it fell. Carthage waged 3 wars. The ancient Greeks claimed that Nubia ruled Egypt, and that the gods descended to feast among the populace. You are aware that none of those people, the Moors, the Nubians, the Numidians, or the Carthaginians, called Africa home. They referred to it as Erkabulan, the mother of humanity, the Garden of Eden, the beginning, the origin, and the source of all that followed. Outsiders were not necessary to give this land purpose. It was meaningful, already ancient, profound, unwavering significance. This land never experienced the horror and cold that the Greeks dreaded in their own winters. Long before any foreign language attempted to encapsulate its identity, this land was constructed differently. Not because it was fortunate due to the fact that those who came from here had distinct physical characteristics. The rest of the world has spent centuries attempting to either replicate, repress, or eradicate the type of human being that is produced by this soil, this sky, and this ancient ground, because it is impossible to ignore. Neither the mother of humanity nor her offspring should offer an apology for what they have created. Don't let it end here. If watching this made you feel something, or if something in your chest changed, what you just heard is just one part of a much bigger story. So make sure to subscribe to this channel, a tale of ancient science, buried philosophies, kingdoms, queens, stolen names, and enduring truths, and every single thread will be pulled. Talk about this with someone who still believes that Africa is just a name, because it is more than that. It was never the case. An identity is a name. A name is a past. The difference between living inside someone else's description of you and knowing who you are. Is your name? This land was devoid of horror. According to the Greeks, according to the ancestors, this land is the mother of humanity. You now know who is telling the truth. Alulan is the original name, the actual name, the true name. Do not forget it.